What's up everyone, Scott the TroutHammer here, and we got another top 5 lure video for you guys, and this time we're going to talk about my top 5 favorite smallmouth bass lures. I got a whole playlist of other top 5 lure videos I've already done. If you guys want to check those out, I'll put the link up here in this corner. And if you guys haven't already, click that subscribe button down there, little notify bell next to it, so you're going to be the first to see all the great content that's going to come from this channel. Now I try to keep my top 5 lure videos relevant to the season, so where are we right now? We're middle to end of February. We're getting close to spring. We're getting to the point where that water temperature is about to tip up into that 50-degree mark. Now when that happens, in rivers and ponds, it usually happens the rivers first in our area, but when that happens, the metabolism of the fish pretty much doubles overnight. So you're going to see those predatory fish, those fish that traditionally spawn, once they get to that comfortable water temperature, smallmouth bass being about 50 degrees, that's when they're going to start actively feeding. That's when they're going to be a lot more catchable. So we're going to talk about my top 5 lures that I use in the rivers around here to catch smallmouth bass. Yep, you saw me. There you go, guys. That's a fish. There you go, guys. That's unreal! Oh, this is such an awesome looking fish. Oh, yeah! Alright, guys, check that out. So first, let's try to understand the smallmouth bass a little bit better. So smallmouth bass are like a largemouth bass, just different colors, different attitudes, smaller mouth obviously, but very different tendencies. So smallmouth bass, they prefer to ambush their prey. They like to hide out in fallen timber, they like to hide out behind rocks and in rocks, wait for prey to come out, and they don't so much do what largemouth bass do, where they just come up, open their mouth, and just create this vacuum, and anything they're going to try to eat is just right into the stomach. Smallmouth bass, they sort of hammer their prey with their head, and then come around again, and then strike it. Unless it's a small enough fish, they can just take in one bite. You'll even see smallmouth bass a lot of times grab something off the bottom, flip it up, and then take it. And the two most common forages for smallmouth bass, at least in this area, are crawfish and bait fish. So a lot of the lures that I picked match those presentations. My number 5 smallmouth bass fishing lure is a swim jig. Now, size, I usually go a little bit smaller with the swim jigs for smallmouth bass because you are fishing for a smaller fish. You will find times where you're going to catch those giant 3+ pound smallmouth, and you can go with a bigger full-size swim jig. I usually stick to like the 1/4 ounce, 5/16 ounce swim jigs when I fish for smallmouth. And color, usually depends on the forage you're going for. Just a green pumpkin with brown hair sort of, matches most of the bait fish and craw colors you're going to find in our rivers. Reason for a swim jig? Well, one of the biggest reasons is because, like I already said, you fish for smallmouth in a lot of areas that have rocks, a lot of areas that have fallen timber, things like that. So you're going to get hung up a lot. And you usually don't hang up as much with a swim jig. You got that weed guard there, but also the way they're set up and the way you retrieve them, they're a lot less likely to get hung up on something like that. But you can swim it, you can just steady retrieve it, you can jig it, you can bounce it off the bottom. A lot of options you can do with a swim jig. Don't just treat it like a swim bait, or something where you put a paddle tail trailer on there or something that will kick and swim like a fish. Put a crawfish trailer on this thing. Watch what happens. Now, instead of picking a football jig, you can still use a football jig. The football jig barely ever gets snagged on anything as long as you fish it right. But the reason why I picked a swim jig is because that fish presentation in that jig head with the eye on there, just something a lot more familiar for the smallmouth bass, something they're used to seeing, something they're used to feeding on. Now, I don't know what it is with our area, I don't know what it is with the temperament of the fish that we have here, but I have seen the most success mismatching the colors with the trailer and the color of the jig that I use. So like this, I probably put on here like a bright orange or a white trailer, or maybe like if I used a black and blue jig, I'd probably go like straight green pumpkin or even like red on the trailer. For some reason, that mix and match color, I don't know what it is, but it seems to trigger the smallmouth in our area just a little bit more. At least that's from my experience. But like I said in other bass fishing videos, jig fishing is my confidence fishing. It's really hard to go wrong anywhere, anytime with a jig. My number 4 favorite smallmouth bass fishing lure is a tube. Really, any size, any color tube. Something about smallmouth bass and tubes, it's like peas and carrots. They just go together. So something the tube has in common with the jig is a magical thing to get predatory fish to react called secondary action, where these tendrils on that tube are going to move independently of the tube even when it's not moving. If you pause it, those tendrils are going to flare out, and it just gives that bass something extra to look at, something that says this is alive. They're used to seeing fish just sort of sit and seeing their fins kind of flutter. If they see a fish just sitting there not moving, a lot of times they're not fooled. That might be a lure, because a lot of times lures don't have those fins that move. But things like this jigs, those plastics that have those tendrils, really do help fool those fish into striking. Most of the time your tube colors are going to have crawfish color patterns. This one's sort of more like a river bait fish pattern. Actually almost kind of looks like a smallmouth bass, like a younger smallmouth bass. But also like the swim jig, you can steady retrieve these things, you can jig these, you can bounce them off the bottom. Bouncing off the bottom is my favorite and in my experience most effective way to fish a tube for smallmouth. And they make tube hooks big enough for these big tubes fishing for bass, but they also make weedless tube hooks. So like your chances of getting hung up, chances of snagging on anything virtually disappear rigging up this way. However, I haven't snagged up too many times using this presentation either. But you look at a tube and you think it could naturally mimic a crawfish, naturally mimic a fish. Again, those things the smallmouth bass are used to seeing, used to feeding on, just really matches the hatch pretty effectively. And again, those tendrils, secondary action, critical for drawing a reaction from a bass, any bass. My number 3 smallmouth bass fishing lure, if I had to pick, I'll just say it's a Senko, but if I had to pick any Senko in particular, most effective, caught the most smallmouth bass on, it's the Yamamoto 4-inch Smoke Shad Senko. That color pattern is just, it's worth its weight in diamonds for smallmouth bass fishing. Obviously with the Yama Senko you got a little bit more weight to it because you're going to make some longer casts in the river and you want this thing out in the water longer, and it's naturally buoyant. Even with like heavier hooks, it doesn't sink very fast. A lot of that's because of the amount of salt they put in these things. I don't know if you guys have ever like ripped into one, like bitten one in half to turn into a Ned rig, and it's just like pure salt inside there. Then of course you rig it up once and it's shredded, you can't use it anymore. Yeah, rigging this thing up with like a 1/0 mosquito hook and wacky rig it, or using like a flick shake rig, or even just like using a just weightless 2/0 EWG hook. Twist this thing like you would any Senko. It'll mimic a fish, mimic a dying fish in the water. But again, seriously, that color and the Yama Senko. I've tried this with Yum Senkos. I've tried this with Big Bite Bait Senkos of the same color. This one beats all of those every time. Really don't need to spend too much time talking about a Senko. I'm pretty sure all my viewers know how to fish Senkos. But if I had to pick any Senko for smallmouth bass, it would definitely be that Yamamoto Senko Smoky Shad color in the 4-inch Senko. My number 2 favorite smallmouth bass fishing lure is a craw plastic, and it could be any craw plastic you want. You know, like the Yamamoto craw worm, Biwa brush hog style craw plastic. My personal favorite is the Riot Baits Fuzzy Beaver. But like I said, smallmouth bass, they are so used to eating crawfish already. They see that craw presentation, they know it's food. It's a lot easier to fool them with something like this. My 2 favorite ways to rig it, either Texas rig, like something like this. I'd use like maybe a 1/4 ounce, or maybe like I said earlier, maybe like a 5/16 ounce weight. Don't have to go very heavy with something this size, but that way you could bring it through those timber piles pretty easily, bring it through the rocks pretty easily, or just, bounce it off the bottom. Or I'd use a stand-up jig head and just let it sit off the bottom. And when you do that, you sort of mimic a crawfish's natural defensive presentation, where it would be sitting up off the bottom, claws up in the air. That's how crawfish get defensive. And a lot of times, and this is critical for fishing with jigs, any sort of craw pattern off the bottom with smallmouth bass, is when you feel that first time the lure moves, wait a second. A lot of times what the smallmouth bass do, they recognize that defensive pattern from the crawfish. They'll grab it by the claws and they'll fling the craw up in the air because they want to come up from behind and swallow it tail first. So when you feel that first movement, wait a second. You're going to feel another movement again. That's when you go set the hook. But if you got this thing Texas rigged, it's still pretty easy to set the hook the first time you feel a fish take it. Again, any size, any style, any color, craw plastics, my number 2 for smallmouth bass fishing. My number 1 smallmouth bass fishing lure, if you guys have watched my channel for any amount of time, you know that this is pretty much the cheat button. Any sort of small bait fish plastic. If I had to pick one particular to display, to demonstrate for this, it's the Biwa Deuce Smallie Party. This thing, I've yet to fish this thing and not catch smallmouth with it. It just seems to be the perfect size, seems to be the perfect color. It's something that, clearly the smallmouth bass in my area are looking for to feed on. It's got a paddle tail with a pretty unique shape on there that gets kicking action even with the slightest and slowest retrieve. My preferred method to rig this thing up is with a peg lock hook with a weight, or like a twist lock hook with a weight. Some of the best ways I've used this thing to retrieve to just get demolished by smallmouth bass is sort of like bouncing off the bottom. You do that like 4 or 5 times, and there's going to be one time somewhere in there where you're not going to feel it hit bottom. Just swing for the fences once you feel that. Straight retrieve this thing next to rock piles. Straight retrieve this thing next to brush piles. It's pretty aerodynamic, and with that hook that I demonstrated, a lot of times, especially in this area, you're going to find smallmouth bass, especially in the heat of the day, they're going to be right under those thick brush piles. Skip it right into that brush pile, let it fall for a couple seconds, and then just enjoy the ride. This thing also makes a fantastic trailer for a swim jig, so I mean, hey, you get a pair up two in the same video. But if there's any one lure I would say go out of your way to get for smallmouth bass fishing, it's the Biwa Deuce in the Smallie party color. There you guys go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you guys learned something. If you did, hey, hit that like button for me. Let me know what you thought down in the comments below. I want to know what your guys' top 5 favorite smallmouth bass lures are. If you guys want other ways to support this channel, I got links in the video description to Instagram, to Facebook, to Patreon, all those goodies. Patreon, completely up to you guys, but I got my reward tier set really low because my means are small. Even $1 goes a long way for this channel, and it's an amount that you probably won't even notice leave your bank account. Easiest and best way to support this channel, just hit that subscribe button, notify bell next to it, so you're going to be the first to see all the great content that's going to come from this channel. Other than that, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, tips up, tight lines, and have fun fishing.